Welcome to True Horror Ghost Stories, where the scariest tales come to life. If you enjoy eerie and mysterious ghost stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to support us in bringing you more spine-chilling experiences. Hashka Proposal from the Dead. He died, but he still wants to marry me. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I once had a beautiful love story with Michael Graves, a gentle yet mysterious man. We were deeply in love and engaged to be married. But tragedy struck. Michael died in a horrific car accident the night before our wedding. Losing him felt like a never-ending nightmare. I fell into depression for months, unable to accept that he was gone. But just as I was trying to move on, the strange things began. 2 months after Michael's death, I received a text message from his phone number. "My love, I'm still here. You can't leave me." I froze. No one had access to Michael's phone. It had been completely destroyed in the accident, according to the police. I tried convincing myself that it was some cruel prank, but the messages kept coming every night. I tried blocking the number, but the messages continued from different unknown numbers. Even worse, every time I read them, I felt like someone was standing right behind me, even though I was alone. One day, when I returned home, I found Michael's engagement ring on my nightstand. I distinctly remembered locking it away in a memory box after his funeral. I rushed to check, and the box was still there, but empty. A chill ran down my spine. How did the ring get out? That night, I dreamt of Michael. He stood at the foot of my bed, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He whispered, "We're not over, Emily. Marry me." I woke up gasping, my heart pounding. The darkness in my room seemed to shift, and I heard breathing next to me. Things got even worse when I received an envelope left outside my door. Inside was a wedding invitation with my name and Michael's, with the wedding date set for the following week. I screamed and threw it away, but when I turned around, the invitation was back on my table. The words on it started changing right before my eyes. "Don't reject me, Emily. If you do, I'll come for you." Terrified, I stayed at my best friend's house, but no matter where I went, I still felt Michael's presence. My bathroom mirror constantly fogged up, revealing eerie messages written as if from the other side. "You can't escape me." On the night of the cursed wedding, I woke up to find myself wearing a white wedding dress, though I had gone to bed in my pajamas. My bedroom door creaked open, and I saw Michael standing there. Not a ghostly figure, but a solid presence, his eyes black as endless voids. He reached out his hand, his voice deep and chilling. "Come, Emily, we'll be together forever." I screamed and ran, but every door in the house was locked shut. In the living room mirror, I saw a twisted reflection. I was standing beside Michael in a dark, abandoned church, surrounded by faceless, shadowy figures watching our unholy wedding. A cold touch ran down my neck as Michael's fingers brushed against my skin. In that moment of sheer terror, I remembered his grave. I bolted out of the house and ran like hell to the cemetery where Michael was buried. Standing before his tombstone, I screamed, "Michael, you're dead! Let me go!" Suddenly, a freezing gust of wind swept through, and I saw Michael's face distort into something no longer human. "Emily, you betrayed me." I shut my eyes and screamed one last time. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was kneeling before Michael's grave. The night was still, the wind was gone, the eerie presence had vanished. I moved away from Charleston soon after, but I know, Michael never truly left. Sometimes I still receive texts from non-existent numbers, I still feel unseen eyes watching me at night, and the engagement ring, no matter how many times I throw it away, it always comes back. Michael is still here, and he will never let me go. My lover was not human. Emily Carter moved to Salem, Massachusetts to take a teaching job at a local high school. She rented an old house on Essex Street with moss-covered stone walls and a gloomy atmosphere. Locals whispered that the house once belonged to a family accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. One night, while strolling through Charter Street Cemetery, Emily encountered a tall man draped in a long black coat. His face was pale and his gray eyes reflected the moonlight. "It's dangerous tonight, young lady," he said, his voice deep and full of warning. A shiver ran down Emily's spine, yet she found herself drawn to the mysterious aura surrounding him. She introduced herself, and he responded with a simple name, Nathaniel Graves. Despite his cryptic warning, Emily found herself meeting Nathaniel again and again. They often spoke about Salem's history, the infamous witch trials of 1692, and unsolved mysteries of the past. There was an undeniable allure to Nathaniel, but Emily also noticed that he was different. He never appeared during the day, avoided large crowds, and sometimes disappeared without a trace. One evening, when she accidentally brushed against his hand, she felt an unnatural coldness, as if his skin held no warmth, no life. One night, while cleaning her house, Emily discovered an old diary hidden within the walls. It belonged to Abigail Graves, a woman who lived in the 17th century. In the diary, Abigail wrote about her husband, Nathaniel Graves, a man who had been executed for witchcraft. Emily froze. The Nathaniel she knew had the same name as a man who had been dead for over 300 years. Determined to uncover the truth, she followed Nathaniel on a full moon night. He silently walked through town and entered an abandoned house on Derby Street. Emily snuck in behind him and witnessed him performing a bizarre ritual. Ancient symbols were drawn on the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense mixed with something metallic. When she accidentally stepped on a loose floorboard, making it creak, Nathaniel turned. His eyes glowed in the darkness. "You shouldn't be here, Emily," he whispered, his voice laced with danger. At last, Nathaniel confessed. He was Nathaniel Graves of the 17th century, a warlock sentenced to death but never truly perished. Before his execution, he had performed a dark ritual, binding his soul to a shadowy entity in exchange for eternal life. "I am no longer human," Nathaniel said, "but I am not entirely a demon either." He had spent centuries hiding in Salem's shadows, waiting, though for what, even he did not know. Then Emily arrived, awakening memories he thought had long faded. But the most terrifying revelation was that the entity he had once bargained with had returned to claim what it was owed. Emily's soul. Strange things began happening to Emily. Nightmares tormented her, shadowy figures lurked in her mirror's reflection, and whispers echoed around her even when she was alone. Nathaniel tried to protect her with ancient charms and rituals, but the entity was growing stronger. It had waited for centuries to claim her soul, for Emily was the descendant of the one who betrayed it in the 17th century. "It won't stop until you belong to it," Nathaniel said, desperation in his eyes. "Then we'll make it stop," Emily replied, her voice steady. On Halloween night, when the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, Nathaniel and Emily performed an ancient ritual at Gallows Hill, the site of the historic witch executions. The wind howled, dark shapes writhed around them, and a massive figure emerged from the abyss. "Nathaniel Graves, you have always belonged to me," the voice boomed. Nathaniel knew there was only one way to end this. He had to sacrifice himself. He turned to Emily, a sorrowful smile on his lips. "You are the most beautiful thing in my immortal life." Before she could stop him, Nathaniel lunged into the entity, dragging it into a magic circle. A blinding light erupted, splitting the night apart, and then silence. Emily woke up in the forest, surrounded by ashes. Nathaniel was gone, but for a brief moment, she saw his silhouette in the distance, smiling before fading into the morning light. She never saw him again, but deep down she knew, somewhere, somehow, he was still watching over her. Their love would never fade. The end. I fell in love with a girl, but she only appeared at night. My name is Ethan Carter, a young writer who moved to Black Hollow, Maine in search of inspiration for my next novel. Black Hollow was a small, gloomy town, surrounded by dark forests and old wooden houses. The locals weren't very friendly. It was as if they all carried an unspoken fear. I rented an isolated house near a desolate lake. The landlord mentioned that the house once belonged to a wealthy family, but every member mysteriously died 20 years ago. His words didn't bother me. I liked the solitude. Everything began on my first night. I sat at my desk, trying to write, but my mind was blank. When I glanced out the window, I saw a girl standing under the moonlight by the lake. She wore a long white dress, her pale skin glowing in the dark, with long black hair cascading down her shoulders. I was immediately captivated. I stepped outside and walked toward her. "Who are you?" I asked. She smiled. "I'm Lillian." Her voice was soft, yet something about it sent a chill down my spine. We talked for a long time. She told me she lived nearby, but never said exactly where. When I asked for her phone number, she shook her head. I don't use a phone, she said. I didn't press further. From that night on, she appeared every night. I slowly fell for her. Lillian always waited for me by the lake, where the moonlight reflected on the still water. I started neglecting my writing, losing track of time. She became my everything. But something was strange. She only appeared at night. No matter how hard I looked for her during the day, I could never find her. One day I asked the townspeople about Lillian. When I described her, their faces turned pale with fear. An old woman whispered, "You must be joking. Lillian died 20 years ago." I laughed. They had to be mistaken. But then she continued, "That girl, she was murdered right by that lake. Her body was thrown into the water. The killer was never found." A chill ran down my spine. That was impossible. I had held her hand, felt her breath. She couldn't be a ghost. But then things became terrifying. The ghost reveals itself. That night, when I met Lillian, I told her what the townspeople had said. She fell silent for a long time. Then she looked straight into my eyes, her gaze deep and dark like an endless abyss. "Do you love me?" she asked. I hesitated. "I do." Lillian stepped closer, her breath cold as ice. "If you love me, then stay with me forever." She pulled me toward the lake. I couldn't resist. Her hands, once warm and delicate, now felt like ice-cold claws, tightening around my wrist. The water seemed to rise unnaturally, swallowing us whole. I struggled, but the more I fought, the stronger she became. Her face changed. From a beautiful girl, it twisted into something wrinkled, hollow-eyed, with a mouth stretched open, revealing sharp teeth. I screamed in terror. Lillian whispered, "Die with me." I thought I was going to die, but then a loud shout echoed. The townspeople. They had been watching me for a while. A man rushed forward and pulled me from the water. Lillian let out an ear-piercing shriek before vanishing into the lake. The townsfolk took me home, their faces grim. An old man muttered, "You're lucky. Many before you have disappeared forever." They told me that anyone Lillian lured would eventually become obsessed with her, and then, one night, they would vanish beneath the lake. The end? I left Black Hollow the next day, but deep down I knew I would never truly escape her. Every night I still dream of Lillian. She stands beneath the moonlight, calling my name, and I'm afraid that one day I won't be able to resist her call. The Wedding Ring of the Dead. I received a mysterious ring and became haunted by its spirit. My name is Ethan Carter, an antique hunter living in New Orleans, Louisiana. My job is to search for valuable items at flea markets, pawn shops, or even abandoned houses. But one object changed my life forever: a worn-out wedding ring, haunted by the soul of the dead. That day, I wandered through an antique market in a small town about 2 hours outside of New Orleans. A dusty, run-down stall caught my attention. Behind the counter sat an old woman with deep wrinkles etched across her face, her tired eyes piercingly sharp. The table was filled with various old trinkets, but what intrigued me the most was a small wooden box. I opened the box. Inside was a gold wedding ring, engraved with the initials M and J, its once bright surface tarnished by time. The moment I picked it up, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The old woman stared at me, her gaze unreadable. "Are you sure? Once you take it, you can never return it." I chuckled. "It's just a ring, right?" I paid her, pocketing the ring. I had no idea that I had just brought home something far worse than a nightmare. That night, back home, I placed the ring on my desk and forgot about it. But from that moment on, strange things began happening. At midnight, I woke up to the sound of faint knocking coming from the living room. I got up to check, but there was no one there. When I turned around, my heart nearly stopped. The ring was gone from my desk. I searched everywhere and finally found it lying on my bed. At that moment, I felt an eerie sensation, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. Over the next few days, I started hearing whispers at night, the soft yet sorrowful voice of a woman. "Give it back to me." My windows would unlock by themselves, no matter how tightly I secured them. Sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I saw a shadow behind me. A woman in a white wedding dress, her pale face void of emotion, her hollow eyes filled with hatred. Terrified, I decided to investigate the origins of the ring. I brought it to my friend Jonathan, a local historian. After days of research, he uncovered a horrifying story. The ring once belonged to Margaret Wilson, a bride from the 1950s. She was murdered on her wedding night by none other than her husband, James Wilson. In a fit of jealous rage, he strangled her to death and hid her body in an old well behind their house. James vanished without a trace, and their home had remained abandoned for decades. Rumors spread that Margaret's spirit still lingered, searching for her lost ring, the symbol of her love. "Ethan, you have to get rid of it. If you don't, you'll be next," Jonathan warned me, but the problem was the ring could not be discarded. I tried everything to rid myself of it. I threw it into a river, yet when I returned home it was lying on my pillow. I took it to a church for an exorcism, but the priest recoiled in horror the moment he touched it. "This ring is cursed. Her spirit clings to it. You must return it to where it belongs." There was only one way to end this. I had to go back to Margaret's abandoned house and place the ring where she had died. That night, I drove deep into the woods where her forsaken home still stood. The air was thick with an ominous chill. As I stepped inside, I felt an invisible presence, as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I found the old well where Margaret had been murdered. Kneeling before it, I placed the ring down and whispered a prayer, hoping her soul would finally find peace. But suddenly, the well began to tremble violently. A powerful gust of wind howled through the house, carrying an agonized scream. A pale, lifeless hand shot up from the darkness, grasping at me, trying to pull me down. I thrashed, screamed, and fought for my life. And then, silence. The ring was gone. And for the first time in weeks, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. From that night on, the strange occurrences stopped. I no longer heard whispers, nor did I see shadows lurking behind me. I believed that Margaret had finally been freed. But a week later, as I woke up one morning, I saw something on my bedside table. A small wooden box. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was the wedding ring. This time, a new engraving had appeared inside the band. "Thank you, but never forget me." I couldn't scream, because I knew I would never escape it. The curse had never ended. Would you dare take an old wedding ring from an antique shop? We promised to love each other forever, even if death parted us. But in reality, it didn't. Catherine Donovan and Michael Reeves grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, a town infamous for its haunting history of witch trials. They had been inseparable since high school, their love like a fairy tale, intense, passionate, and all-consuming. But beneath the beauty of their relationship lurked an obsession so deep that neither of them could see the darkness creeping in. One full moon night, they stood together by the desolate Blackwood Lake, a place shrouded in eerie legends. Locals whispered that the land was cursed, that spirits roamed its waters. But Catherine and Michael weren't afraid. Michael suddenly pulled out a small knife. "I want us to be together forever, Catherine. Let's make a promise." Catherine hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Michael made a small cut on his fingertip, letting dark crimson droplets drip onto the ground. She did the same, their blood mixed, seeping into the damp earth. "I swear to love you always, Catherine. Even in death, I will return to you." Catherine clutched his hand tightly, her eyes burning with devotion. "Me too. Nothing will ever separate us." What they didn't know was that something in the shadows had been listening, and it had accepted their promise in the worst way imaginable. 3 years later, on a stormy night, tragedy struck. Michael's car skidded off the road at Old Creek Road, plummeting down a steep ravine. When the police arrived, they found his car mangled beyond recognition. His body was nearly unidentifiable. The funeral was filled with grief, but Catherine refused to believe he was truly gone. And then strange things began to happen. Michael's framed photographs inexplicably fell from the walls. The ring he had given her, locked away in a jewelry box, kept reappearing on her dresser. Then, one rainy night, her phone buzzed with a message. The sender's number was Michael's. "Did you forget our promise? I'm still here." Catherine's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she called back, but only heavy breathing echoed from the other end. The bedroom door creaked open slowly. Catherine screamed. But the room was empty. Only a faint, shadowy figure lingered in the mirror's reflection. The next night, she made her way to Hollow Hill Cemetery, where Michael had been buried. The wind howled through the gravestones, skeletal tree branches clawing at the sky like withered fingers. When she reached Michael's grave, her heart stopped. The coffin was open. With shaking hands, she brushed aside the damp soil and peered inside. The coffin was empty. Michael was gone. A raspy voice whispered from behind her. "I made a promise, Catherine. I will never leave you." Catherine spun around. Standing before her was Michael, but no longer the man she had loved. His skin was ghastly pale, his eyes empty voids of darkness. Rotting flesh peeled from his face, revealing raw, decaying muscle beneath. His clothes were the same ones he had worn the night of the crash, torn, dirt-streaked, and dripping with moisture. He reached for her, his icy fingers brushing her cheek. "Now it's your turn to keep your promise." Catherine let out a shriek and bolted. But no matter how fast she ran, his footsteps were always right behind hers. After that night, Catherine was never the same. She barricaded herself inside her house, but Michael's presence was inescapable. Every time she glanced in a mirror, he was standing right behind her. Every night, he whispered to her in the dark. "Come with me, Catherine. We belong together." Desperate, she sought out Eleanor, an old recluse rumored to be a spiritual medium. The old woman peered into her eyes and sighed deeply. "A blood oath can never be broken. There is only one way out." Catherine clutched the woman's arm. "What is it?" A twisted smile crept across Eleanor's lips. "You must die so your soul can join him." Catherine fled in terror, but no matter where she went, Michael followed. He lurked in her dreams, in the shadows of her home, in the very air she breathed. And then, one stormy night, she vanished. Her bedroom door was found wide open. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind wailing like a chorus of lost souls. On her desk, written in crimson smears, was a message: "We are together forever." No one ever saw Catherine again, but on nights of the full moon by the shore of Blackwood Lake, two figures can be seen standing side by side. A man with hollow, blackened eyes, a woman with a twisted, frozen smile. Young lovers who visit the lake sometimes hear a voice carried on the wind. Make a promise, swear to love each other forever, and those who do disappear on a stormy night. He came back. My lover has been gone for a long time, but I still see him every night. I am Emily Carter, 27 years old, living in a small town in Maine. 3 years ago, I lost my boyfriend, Daniel Grayson, in a horrific car accident. That night, we argued over something trivial. I walked away first, leaving him behind. And just minutes later, I got the news that Daniel had been hit by a truck while crossing the street. The police ruled it an accident. But I knew that if I hadn't walked away, if I had held him back, maybe Daniel would still be alive. I've lived with guilt for the past 3 years. But the worst part is not losing Daniel, it's that I still see him. At first, I thought they were just dreams. A shadow gliding past the hallway at night, a familiar voice whispering as I drifted off to sleep. But then, things became clearer. I saw him in the mirror, standing by the window when I pulled the curtains open, even on the street where he had died. And last night, he stood right next to my bed. That night, I woke up at midnight, feeling someone watching me. When I opened my eyes, my heart nearly exploded. Daniel was standing there, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the curtains. He looked exactly as he did 3 years ago. The white shirt he wore on the last day I saw him, those deep blue eyes, but his skin was paler than before. "Emily," he whispered. I screamed, leapt from my bed, and turned on the light. But as soon as the room was flooded with brightness, Daniel was gone. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. No way was I dreaming, but the sensation was too real. His scent, the cold air radiating from his body. I decided not to sleep again. I sat in the living room, wrapped tightly in a blanket, trying to calm myself. But then my phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Do you miss me?" My throat went dry. My hands trembled as I replied, "Who is this?" But there was no answer. Then my phone shut off on its own, and the door to my bedroom slowly creaked open, even though I was sure I had closed it. After that night, I decided to find out what was happening. I went to see Sarah, my best friend and a researcher of the paranormal. Sarah listened carefully as I recounted everything. After a moment of silence, she said, "Emily, what if that's not Daniel?" I froze. "What do you mean?" There are entities that can take the form of our loved ones. They feed on grief and loss to enter our lives. I shivered, but I knew it was Daniel. I could feel it. Sarah sighed. If you want to be sure, we need to investigate Daniel's accident. We went to the police station to review the case files, and that was when we uncovered a horrifying truth. Daniel didn't die instantly. Witnesses said that before he took his last breath, he had tried to say something, but because of his injuries, no one could understand him. There was something even stranger. The driver who hit Daniel vanished without a trace. The police investigated but found no records of him. The truck had no clear license plate, as if it had never existed. A chill ran down my spine. How exactly had Daniel died, and who had killed him? Since I started digging into the accident, things had gotten worse. Every night, Daniel appeared more frequently. He didn't just stand and watch me anymore. He started getting closer. I could feel his cold breath, his icy fingers brushing against my skin. And then he spoke. "You have to come with me." I panicked. Go where? But Daniel didn't answer. He just repeated the same words, this time more urgently. "You have to come with me." Sarah warned me not to respond to the call. If I did, I might never come back. But I couldn't abandon Daniel. I needed to know what had happened. So that night, when Daniel appeared again and reached out his hand, I decided to take it. And the world around me went black. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on an empty road. It was pitch dark, with only a flickering streetlight casting weak light. And in front of me was the truck from that night. The door swung open, and a man stepped out. His face was pale, his eyes black and hollow. Daniel stood beside me, his expression filled with pain. He's not human. My heart pounded wildly. I stepped back, but Daniel held onto my hand. The man smirked. "You shouldn't have come back." And then I realized he had no shadow. I screamed as he lunged at me, but Daniel pushed me behind him, shielding me. "He's the one who killed me," Daniel said, "and now he wants to kill you too." Before I could react, a blinding light enveloped me. I felt my body being pulled backward. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. Was it all just a dream? But when I looked down at my hand, I saw a mark, a cold handprint. And on the fogged-up window, a message was scrawled in shaky letters. "Be careful. He's still here." I don't know what will happen next, but I know one thing. Daniel came back to warn me, and this battle is far from over. The Mirror of Black Hollow. Black Hollow lay nestled deep within the shadowy pine forests of Oregon, where thick fog smothered the sunlight, allowing only fleeting glimpses of daylight. The small town held a wild yet somber beauty, as if it harbored a secret no one dared to speak of. Emily Carter arrived on an October afternoon, watching golden leaves drift onto the dirt road leading to the house she and Daniel had just bought. The two-story wooden home, with its moss-covered roof and dust-veiled windows, looked like a forgotten relic from another time. The price had been impossibly low, too tempting to pass up, yet as she stepped over the threshold, an unshakable chill crawled up her spine. "How do you feel?" Daniel asked, carrying their suitcases inside, his familiar warm smile offering comfort. "I'm fine," she said, pushing aside her unease. "It just needs a little cleaning, and then it'll feel like home." In 2 months, they planned to marry in the backyard of this very house, surrounded by close friends and family. Emily had dreamed of this day for years, the white dress, the floral crown in her hair, and the way Daniel would look at her as he vowed to be hers forever. But that night, as she stood before the large mirror in their bedroom, brushing her hair, that dream began to fracture. The mirror was old, its wooden frame carved with intricate patterns, resembling withered vines tangled together. In the dim glow of the bedside lamp, she saw only her own reflection at first. But when she tilted her head slightly, something flickered, just for a second. A shadow moving behind her. She turned quickly. Nothing. The room remained empty, save for the muffled sounds of Daniel unpacking downstairs. "Just tired," she whispered to herself, placing the brush down and switching off the light. Dreams that did not belong to her. That night, Emily dreamed of a wedding. Not hers. She stood in a bedroom identical to theirs, though older, its wallpaper yellowed, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Before the mirror stood a woman in a wedding dress, her face obscured by a veil of white lace. Slowly, she lifted it. Emily screamed. 2 pitch-black eyes, void of sclera, stared back at her. The woman smiled, her lips red as blood, and whispered a name, Lillian. Emily awoke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. Daniel slept soundly beside her, his breathing steady. Her gaze darted toward the mirror. In the darkness, she could swear she saw a figure standing there, faint but unmistakably present. When nightmares become reality, the dreams were only the beginning. In the days that followed, Emily heard footsteps creaking on the floor above while she stood alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. Once, she found her engagement ring, not on the dresser where she had left it, but neatly placed at the base of the mirror's frame. And then, on a rainy night, as she tied her hair in front of the mirror, she saw it. A face that wasn't hers. Pale skin, hollow black eyes, a twisted, unnatural smile, not a reflection. Lillian. Emily screamed, the hairbrush slipping from her fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. Daniel rushed in, eyes filled with concern. But when he looked into the mirror, he saw nothing, just their own reflections. "You're exhausted," he said, pulling her close. "I'll take the mirror down first thing tomorrow, okay?" But that night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep, Emily heard it. A whisper. Not from the room, from inside the mirror. It wasn't a voice, it was the sound of wind threading through dead leaves, layered with a deep, guttural growl. She turned on the light. Lillian stood at the edge of the frame, closer than ever. Her fingers, sharp, claw-like, scraped against the glass from the inside, leaving faint, jagged marks. "You won't escape." The words didn't come from the mirror. They echoed inside Emily's mind. She bolted from the room, heart hammering. Tomorrow, she would find out the truth about this house. Black Hollow held the answers, and she would not let the thing in the mirror steal her wedding day. The last night at Black Hollow was a living nightmare. Rain poured down as if trying to drown the old house, the roar of water blending with the eerie sounds coming from the mirror in the bedroom. Emily stood before it, trembling, gripping the hammer Maggie had given her. Old Mrs. Reed, with her sharp eyes and rasping voice, had revealed the only way to break the curse. Shatter the mirror and burn the shards in a fire laced with salt, before Lillian could fully pull her into the other side. Daniel stood beside her, holding a gasoline can, his face pale but resolute. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "What if Maggie was wrong?" "I have no choice," Emily replied, her eyes locked on the mirror. Lillian stood within it, no longer a shadowy figure, but horrifyingly clear. Her tattered wedding dress hung in damp shreds, her long black hair matted and dripping, and her eyes, black, endless voids, bore into Emily's soul. She tilted her head, a crooked smile stretching too wide, revealing jagged, razor-sharp teeth. "You think you can escape, Emily?" Lillian's voice didn't come from the mirror. It came from the walls, from the very air. "I've waited too long. This house is mine, and now, so are you." Emily took a deep breath and raised the hammer. But before she could strike, the mirror trembled violently. A skeletal hand, nails like knives, shot through the glass and latched onto her wrist. Ice cold. Emily screamed, trying to wrench free, but Lillian's grip was inhumanly strong. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Emily's waist, pulling with all his might. But the mirror's surface rippled like liquid, sucking Emily in. Her vision blurred. The world twisted. Then, darkness. The air was thick with the scent of blood and damp earth. Emily staggered to her feet, heart pounding. She was inside the mirror. Around her stood a warped, decayed version of the house, walls smeared with dark stains, floorboards rotting beneath her feet. The air was heavy, pressing against her chest. Lillian stood before her, no longer just a spirit, but something far worse. Her cracked skin oozed blackened blood, her mouth twisted into a mockery of a smile, and her elongated fingers stretched toward Emily. "Welcome to our wedding," she whispered, voice dripping with malice. Emily backed away, panic rising. "I am not you. I will not die here." Lillian's laughter was like shattering glass. "Don't you see? Every bride who enters this house belongs to me. I need your body to live again. And Daniel, he will betray you, just like the man who betrayed me." "No!" Emily screamed. Lillian's words crawled into her mind. Memories of Daniel's stolen glances at the mirror, Maggie's warnings. But Emily shook her head. "No, Daniel loves me. He's fighting for me." Lillian lunged, claws aimed at Emily's heart. Emily dodged, her eyes darting toward a warped, fractured mirror. The way out. She sprinted, but Lillian was faster. Fire blazed in her black eyes. "You will never leave." Outside, Daniel swung the hammer against the mirror's surface. It did not break, it rippled. "Maggie, do something," he shouted. The old woman, clutching a worn leather book, tossed a pouch of salt at his feet. "Burn it! Fire and salt will force her to release Emily." Daniel didn't hesitate. He doused the mirror with gasoline and struck a match. Flames roared to life. A blood-curdling scream erupted from inside. Emily felt the ground quake beneath her. Lillian turned, her flesh smoldering, smoke curling from her body. "No!" she howled as the fire consumed her. Emily seized her chance. She hurled herself toward the fractured mirror, pounding against the surface. "Daniel!" Daniel heard her. With one final swing, he shattered the burning mirror. A blinding light engulfed the room, then silence. Emily tumbled onto the floor, coughing, shaking. Daniel grabbed her, holding her tightly. "Are you okay? Oh God, I thought I lost you." She nodded, though her whole body trembled. Maggie stepped forward, staring at the smoldering remains. "She's gone," she murmured. "The curse is broken." 2 days later, Emily and Daniel left Black Hollow behind, its ruins smoldering in the distance. They planned their wedding far from that haunted place. The night before the ceremony, in a quiet Portland hotel, Emily stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting her dress. She smiled, truly at peace for the first time in weeks. But as she turned away for just a fleeting second, the reflection wasn't hers. Lillian's black eyes stared back, a crooked, knowing smile. Then, gone. Emily whirled around. The mirror showed only her own face, a beautiful bride. But her eyes, just for a moment, held a flicker of something, cold. She stepped out, took Daniel's hand, and smiled. "Let's go, love," she said, her voice just a little too sweet. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the moonlight. The end. Or is it? My name is Evelyn Hart, 28 years old, a freelance journalist living in the small town of Raven Hollow, Vermont. This town has nothing remarkable except for its eerie pine forests and the endlessly harsh winters. My life wasn't anything special either, writing articles for a few local newspapers, drinking stale coffee in my shabby apartment, and trying to forget the wreckage of a broken relationship. But everything changed on one cold February afternoon when I received an unmarked package. The package was left at my doorstep, a worn wooden box with chipped edges, covered in dust as if it had just been unearthed from the ground. Inside was a bundle of yellowed papers, tied together with a faded red ribbon. I untied it, and the first thing that caught my eye was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was shaky yet elegant, like that of someone who had lived a century ago. The first line made my heart pound. "I will wait for you, even in death. Don't let them tear us apart, Margaret." The letter was signed Samuel. There was no date, but the paper was brittle, the ink faded, as if time itself had tried to erase this story. I had no idea who Margaret was or why the letter had found its way to me. But something about those words, the despair, the pain, and that ominous promise, made it impossible for me to discard it. I decided to keep it and find out more. Raven Hollow was a strange place to start an investigation. This town had a dark history, with whispered tales of ghosts told around fireplaces at night. The locals believed that the old cemetery to the north, where moss-covered tombstones lay silently beneath the trees, was home to restless spirits. I had never believed in such things until Samuel's letter pulled me into a nightmare. Welcome to True Horror Ghost Stories, where the scariest tales come to life. If you enjoy eerie and mysterious ghost stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to support us in bringing you more spine-chilling experiences. Returning home, I locked the door tightly, drew the curtains, and curled up on the sofa with the letter in my hands. I read every line again, searching for clues. Samuel wrote about a forbidden love, about them, those who had torn him and Margaret apart. He mentioned an old house on the hill where he once lived and made a vow that he would never give up on her, even in death. I couldn't sleep that night. Every small sound, the wind rattling against the window, the floorboards creaking, made me jump. As dawn approached, I heard a knock at the door. Slow. Knock. 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 Gripping a kitchen knife, I cautiously approached. Through the gap, I saw a tall, gaunt figure standing motionless under the streetlight. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes, glowing, eerily white, stared straight at me. "Evelyn," a voice echoed, cold and hollow. "You have read my letter." I screamed, stumbling backward, dropping the knife. When I finally mustered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. But on the doorstep, where he had stood, lay a withered flower, deep crimson like blood. The next morning, I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. The deep red flower lay on the kitchen table, a vivid reminder of last night. I picked it up between two fingers, carefully, as if it might bite me. The petals were wilted, but the sickly sweet scent still lingered, making my head throb. I threw it into the trash, but the fragrance clung to the air, seeping into every corner of the room. Samuel's letter mentioned a house on the hill. I knew the place, Grayson Manor, like an old estate about 5 miles from Raven Hollow, abandoned for decades. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed after the Grayson family met a tragic fate over a century ago. I didn't believe in curses, but after what had happened at the cemetery and outside my door, I was beginning to doubt my own logic. I drove up the hill at noon, the pale sunlight filtering through the gray clouds. Grayson Manor loomed like a giant specter among the pine trees, a 2-story house of wood and stone, its tiled roof crumbling, its shattered windows revealing the darkness within. The rusted iron gate groaned as I pushed it open, and the air around me felt heavy, as if time had long since stopped here. I stepped through the front door, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. Inside, it was pitch black, with only a few streaks of light slipping through the rotting boards on the windows. The air smelled of damp wood, earth, and something else, something sickly sweet, just like the flower from last night. I switched on my flashlight, sweeping its beam across the main hall. A dusty, old piano stood in the corner, its yellowed keys resembling the teeth of a corpse. A large portrait hung on the wall, but the face had been scratched beyond recognition. I found a staircase leading to the second floor. With each step, the floorboards groaned as if protesting my presence. At the end of the upstairs hallway, I saw a wooden door carved with strange patterns, curved lines twisting like veins. I pushed it open and stepped into a small bedroom. A rusted iron bed stood in the center, its sheets tattered, and on the pillow lay a deep red flower, identical to the one I had thrown away that morning. My heart pounded. Before I could turn back, the door slammed shut behind me. I gasped, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard breathing, slow, heavy, coming from the corner of the room. I shone my flashlight, but there was nothing except darkness. The breathing grew louder, closer, as if someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, and for a fleeting moment, I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure, its eyes glowing white in the darkness. It had no face, just a faint, blurry void where its nose and mouth should have been. "Evelyn," the voice murmured, deep and chilling. "You have arrived." I screamed, pounding on the door in panic. It burst open, and I bolted, racing down the stairs and out of the house. When I glanced back from the gate, I saw it, standing motionless at the second-floor window, its glowing white eyes fixed on me. I don't dare return to Grayson Manor alone anymore, but I also can't stop. That shadow, Samuel, if it really is him, is hunting me. I need answers. I went back to the library to find Mrs. Clara again. This time, I told her everything that had happened. The elderly woman listened, her frail hands trembling as she gripped her cane. "Samuel Grayson," she said, her voice lowering. "He was in love with a girl named Margaret Hale, the daughter of a wealthy family in Raven Hollow, but their love was forbidden. Margaret's father, Henry Hale, was a ruthless man. He believed Samuel was unworthy, just a poor boy trying to reach above his station. They say Samuel was murdered, buried alive in his own grave, as a warning to anyone who dared defy the Hale family." "Buried alive?" I repeated, a chill creeping down my spine. Mrs. Clara nodded. "That's the rumor. But no one dared to dig up the grave to find out. As for Margaret, she disappeared soon after. Some say she took her own life out of grief. Others believe her family killed her to cover up the scandal. Either way, Samuel's soul never found peace. He swore he would find Margaret again, even beyond death." I left the library with a heavy mind. Did Samuel think I was Margaret? Or was he just using me to find her? I didn't know, but I could feel it. Step by step, he was getting closer. That night, I dreamed I was standing in a cemetery in front of Samuel's grave. The earth beneath my feet started to crack, and pale, bony hands emerged, grasping at my ankles. I tried to run, but they dragged me down, deep into the ground. I heard Samuel's whisper in my ear, "You are mine, Margaret, forever." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, only to see a damp trail of soil on the floor, stretching from my bed to the door. The next day, I received another letter. It lay in my mailbox, its paper yellowed with age, the handwriting unmistakably Samuel's. "Come to me tonight. Grayson Manor. Do not refuse me again, Margaret." I wanted to throw it away, to flee from Raven Hollow, but something inside me, curiosity or a strange pull, made it impossible to refuse. I arrived at Grayson Manor at midnight. The full moon shone brightly, casting an eerie glow over the house like a haunted painting. I carried a small knife and a crucifix, not because I believed in God, but because I needed something to hold on to. The front door stood wide open, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, and the freezing air swallowed me whole. "Samuel?" I called out, my voice unsteady. My words echoed through the empty house. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from upstairs. I climbed the staircase, each step pulling me closer to the abyss. At the end of the hallway, the bedroom door was open, and inside Samuel stood there. He was no longer a faint shadow. He had a clear, solid form, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered 19th century clothes, his skin waxy and deathly pale. His eyes were pure white, devoid of pupils. One side of his face had rotted away, exposing bone and withered tendons. He smiled, a twisted, horrifying grin. "Evelyn," he said, his voice deep and hollow, like an echo from the bottom of a well. "No, I'm not Evelyn. I'm Margaret. You've come back to me." "I'm not Margaret," I screamed, stepping back. "I'm Evelyn Hart. Margaret has been dead for a long time." Samuel tilted his head, his smile vanishing. "You're lying. I can feel you. Your soul. I have waited too long." He stepped forward, the floorboards trembling under his weight. I raised the knife, gripping it tightly. "Stay back!" I shouted, but Samuel did not stop. He lifted his hand, and the knife in my grasp grew scorching hot. I cried out as it fell from my hand, clattering onto the floor. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in front of me. I was trapped. I pounded on the door frantically, my nails scraping against the wood until they bled, but the door wouldn't budge. Samuel's footsteps echoed behind me, slow, steady, like the rhythm of death. I turned around, pressing my back against the door, watching as he approached. The stench of decayed earth and wilted flowers emanated from his body, so thick that I had to hold my breath. His milky white eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, emotionless. "You can't run," he said, his voice deep and grating, like stones grinding together. "I've waited for you for centuries. I called you back from the grave, and now you're here." "I'm not Margaret," I screamed again, tears spilling over from sheer terror and despair. "I'm Evelyn Hart. Margaret is dead, Samuel. She's gone." Samuel stopped, only a few steps away. His head tilted slightly as if trying to process my words. For a moment, a flicker of pain crossed his lifeless eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fury. "No," he growled. "You are Margaret. I can feel you. Your soul has returned, even in a different body. They couldn't keep you from me forever." I didn't know who he meant. Who were they? But I had no time to ask. Samuel raised his hand, and the floor beneath me trembled. Cracks spread out from where he stood, and from the widening fissures, damp black soil surged up, accompanied by skeletal, ghostly hands reaching for me. I screamed, jumping to the side, but they pursued me, clawing at my ankles, dragging me down. "No! Let me go!" I thrashed and kicked, but the hands were unnaturally strong. They were freezing cold, their sharp nails tearing into my skin, leaving thin lines of blood. Samuel stood motionless, watching me with a twisted smile. "You will stay with me," he said, "beneath the earth where they can't take you from me again." I reached into my pocket, grasping the small cross I always carried, and held it up toward him. "Stay away from me!" I screamed. The cross seemed to repel him. He flinched, taking a step back, his white eyes narrowing in pain. The hands loosened their grip, retreating into the ground. I didn't wait. I lunged for the door, slamming my shoulder against it with all my strength. This time it burst open, and I stumbled into the hallway. I ran down the stairs, out of Grayson Manor, never daring to look back. But as I reached the gates, a bitter wind howled through the air, carrying Samuel's whisper, "You can't run forever, Margaret." I drove home, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My mind spun with unanswered questions. Samuel wasn't just a ghost, he was something stronger, bound by a curse or a dreadful oath. And he believed I was Margaret reborn. I needed to know the truth, not just to escape him, but to hold on to what little sanity I had left. I returned to the library the next morning, though my body was exhausted from a sleepless night. Mrs. Clara wasn't there, but I found an old book in the archives, a journal belonging to Henry Hale, Margaret's father, preserved as a historical document. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. I flipped to the final entries, and what I read sent ice through my veins. Henry Hale wrote that Margaret had fallen in love with Samuel Grayson, a farmhand on their estate. To him, it was a disgrace, a stain on the Hale family's name. When Margaret refused to give up Samuel, Henry took matters into his own hands. He hired men to beat Samuel nearly to death, then had him buried alive in the cemetery, right beneath the headstone I had seen. But that wasn't the worst part. When Margaret discovered the truth, she confronted her father. In a fit of rage, Henry pushed her down the stairs of Grayson Manor. Back then, still a Hale property. She died instantly, and Henry covered up the crime, claiming she had run away. But the most horrifying part was the final line in the journal. I hear her every night, knocking, whispering my name, and sometimes I see Grayson's figure beneath the pine tree, his eyes white as death, staring at me. They do not forgive. I shut the journal, my hands shaking. Samuel didn't just want revenge, he wanted Margaret back, no matter the cost. And now, he believed I was her. But why? I had no connection to the Hale or Grayson families. Or did I? That night, I decided to face Samuel one last time. I couldn't live in fear forever. I brought Henry Hale's journal, an oil lamp, and a jar of salt, something I had read about in a few exorcism texts. My heart pounded in my chest as I returned to Grayson Manor. The house was eerily silent. As I stepped inside, I went straight to the bedroom where I had been trapped before. Samuel was waiting for me, standing in the middle of the room, his milky white eyes glowing in the darkness. "You came back," he said, his voice strangely gentle. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." "Listen, Samuel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am not Margaret. She is dead. Her father killed her right here in this house. I have proof." I held up the journal. "She never left you by choice. Her life was stolen from her." Samuel was silent, his ghostly eyes flickering. I continued, "You don't have to do this. You can let go. You can finally rest." He took a step forward, and I stepped back. But this time, he didn't attack. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice breaking, "what did they do to you?" "You know the truth now," I said. "Let me go, Samuel. I am not her." But instead of releasing me, Samuel let out a monstrous roar, a sound not of this world. The floor trembled violently, and hands erupted from the ground, more numerous than before. "If you're not Margaret," he growled, "then I'll make you become her." I poured the salt into a circle around myself, hoping it would protect me as the books had said. The hands recoiled upon touching the salt, but Samuel did not stop. He lunged at me, and I dodged to the side, knocking over the oil lamp. Flames burst forth, quickly consuming the dry wooden floor. The house began to burn, and Samuel screamed, a sound of agony and fury. I ran outside as the fire swallowed Grayson Manor. From a distance, I saw Samuel's silhouette standing amid the flames, his white eyes staring at me one last time before the house collapsed, burying him in the ashes. After Grayson Manor burned to the ground, I thought it was over. The fire had reduced the house to ashes, and I hoped that Samuel, along with his terrifying haunt, had been buried forever beneath the ruins. But I was wrong. In the days that followed, I began to realize that destroying the house was only the beginning of a new nightmare. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Samuel's milky white gaze staring at me from the darkness, his twisted lips whispering my name. Not Evelyn, but Margaret. The slow, rhythmic knocking still echoed through the night, steady like the heartbeat of someone long dead. I searched the house, but I never found anyone, only an old pair of leather shoes standing silently at my doorstep. Once I gathered the courage to pour gasoline over them and set them ablaze, but the next morning they reappeared, untouched by fire, as if the flames could never reach them. I tried to leave Raven Hollow. I packed my belongings, stuffed my suitcase into the car, and drove straight toward the highway. But every time I passed the sign that read, "Leaving Raven Hollow," my car would stall for no reason. The engine sputtered and died, and when I stepped out to check, I saw black, wet handprints smeared across my windshield, like someone had been clinging to it from the outside. I turned back to town, not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. I started to doubt myself. Was I losing my mind? Or had Samuel truly found a way to keep me here, to make me a part of the curse he could never escape? I needed answers, and there was only one last place to look: the old cemetery, where it all began. I went to the cemetery on a moonless night when darkness wrapped everything like a suffocating blanket. I carried a crowbar, a flashlight, and a jar of salt, the last things I could rely on. Samuel's grave was still there, the gray tombstone covered in moss, but the inscription, "I'm still waiting for you," had disappeared. In its place was a deep crack, as if something beneath was trying to break free. I didn't want to do this, but I had no way out. If Samuel was still chasing me, I had to face him, not in the haunted house, but right where he had been buried. I drove the crowbar into the ground and began to dig. The soil was soft, damp, and easily gave way with each stroke of the shovel. The stench of decay rose thickly, mixed with the sickly sweet scent of wilting flowers, something I had become far too familiar with. After digging about 3 feet deep, I hit something solid, a wooden coffin lid, rotted with time. I took a deep breath and pried it open with the crowbar. The sound of splintering wood echoed sharply in the silent night. I shone my flashlight down, and what I saw almost made me drop it. The coffin was empty. No bones, no corpse, only dark soil and a single crimson flower lying in the center, fresh as if it had just been picked. "Evelyn," the voice came from behind me. Cold, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. I turned around. Samuel stood there, just a few steps away. He was no longer a decayed specter or a shadowy figure. He looked nearly alive. His skin was deathly pale, his eyes milky white, and he wore a gentle yet terrifying smile. His tattered clothes were covered in dirt, as if he had just crawled out from the grave. "The coffin is empty," I stammered, stepping back. "You weren't there. You were never there, were you?" Samuel tilted his head, his smile widening. "I don't need a coffin, Margaret. I left long ago, thanks to you." "I'm not Margaret," I screamed, hurling the jar of salt at him. The grains scattered across the ground, but he merely chuckled, stepping through them as if they meant nothing. "Don't you remember?" he whispered, his voice unnervingly tender. "You helped me. You read the letter. You woke me up." I shook my head, my heart pounding. "No, I didn't do anything. I just found the letter. But then I stopped. A flicker of memory surfaced. Not mine, but someone else's. I saw myself standing in a dimly lit room, wearing an old-fashioned dress, holding a candle. In front of me sat a man, Samuel, bound to a chair, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He looked at me and whispered, "Don't let them win, Margaret. Call me back." And then I saw myself, Margaret, taking a knife, slicing into my palm, letting the blood drip onto the floor as I muttered incantations I didn't understand. I gasped, stumbling backward, falling onto the damp earth. No, this isn't real. That wasn't me. "But it was you," Samuel murmured, kneeling before me. His fingers, cold as ice, brushed against my cheek. "Your soul has returned in this body. I have waited, and now we can be together forever." I pushed him away, crawling backward on the ground, but Samuel didn't chase me. He just stood there, staring at me with those milky white eyes as if he knew I couldn't escape. And then I realized something horrifying. I could feel him. Not fear, not terror, but a deep, aching sorrow. A twisted love that I couldn't explain. It wasn't mine. It was Margaret's. I stood up, trembling, and looked down at my hands. Under the flashlight's glow, I saw the faint scars on my wrists, marks I had always thought were childhood accidents. But now they perfectly matched Margaret's memories, the ritual she had performed to call Samuel back. "No," I whispered. "No, it can't be." Samuel stepped closer, his voice gentle yet haunting. "You swore to me, Margaret. You used your blood to bind us together. I cannot rest, and neither can you. We are one." I screamed and bolted out of the cemetery, running past rows of tombstones. But when I reached the main road, I stopped, gasping for breath. A pair of old leather shoes stood before me, empty, worn, unmoving. I turned around, and Samuel was right behind me, his white eyes glowing in the darkness. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "Beneath the earth, where they can't tear us apart anymore." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I'm not her, Samuel. I'm Evelyn. I have my own life." But he only smiled. "Evelyn or Margaret, you are still mine." The ground beneath me cracked open, and hands emerged, more than ever before. They grabbed me, pulling me down. I struggled, screamed, but their grip was too strong. Samuel knelt, watching me one last time as I was dragged into the earth. "I love you," he whispered, and then the darkness swallowed me whole. The next day they found my car near the cemetery, but I was nowhere to be seen. The cemetery remained silent, with no trace of the digging from the night before. Samuel Grayson's tombstone still stood there, but now, beside it, was a new gravestone. One with no dates, only the inscription, "Evelyn Hart. May her soul rest in peace." The people of Raven Hollow whispered that sometimes, on moonless nights, they could hear slow knocks coming from beneath the ground, followed by a deep, somber voice calling out, "Margaret, where are you?" But no one dared to come closer to find out. Beneath the earth, in the cold darkness, am I still Evelyn Hart? Or have I become Margaret, forever bound by a love that transcends the grave? I do not know anymore. I only know that in the darkness I am no longer alone.